So the question is, why when it comes to idolatry, Hashem writes written clearly, the halacha is that one must give up his life not to commit and violate the sin of idolatry in prostrate in front of an idol and so on and so forth, or any way idolatry can and it would be committed. And when it comes to the other sins, we know that pikuach nefesh doiches shar avedos, that if one's life is in danger, that overrides all the other sins. If someone tells you, if you're going to open this light on Shabbos, I'll let you go. If you're not going to open this light on Shabbos, we're going to kill you. You're allowed to open this light on Shabbos, because no sin is overridden by pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh overrides. Sin does not override pikuach nefesh. To spare someone's soul, you're allowed to violate any avera, except the three averas, which is idolatry, adultery, and murder. So focusing on idolatry, which is about renouncing the oneness of Hashem, one has to give up his life, his or her life completely. And so the question is, if based on this whole explanation, that every sin is every mitzvah is a Nechi Hashem Lekech, I am Hashem your God, which is again the positive dimension of the Achdus Hashem, the Aveda, the general idea of idolatry, the positive, in other words, renouncing the oneness of Hashem by proclaiming Anechi Hashem Lekech, it exists or lies within every mitzvah. And similarly, when a loisas, every Aveda, every sin is about lo yilachol kimachir malpone, which means not renouncing the oneness of Hashem. So how come by idolatry it's demanded of a yid to give up his life for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the other Avedas, one does not have to give up his life for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's what Al Rebbe asked. Why is pikuach nefesh deichashar Avedas? The fact that pikuach nefesh, this principle of saving life, overrides other sins, and man has the command, he has the mandate that when it comes to a test, if his life is in danger, shall he violate and transgress and not give up his life by other sins? So why is it, which this seems to connote from a certain perspective and point of view, that every sin is not idolatry? Because for idolatry one has to give up his life. For the other sins he does not need to. And quite on the contrary, there's certain even poskim would say you're not even allowed to. Which wouldn't that say that every sin is not about idolatry? So what are you telling me till Rebbe says, what am I telling you till now? That in essence every sin, with all the explanation that I explained you, which was a beautiful, rational build-up over here, how every sin is essentially and virtually the sin of idolatry. The question begs, why by idolatry one must give up his life, as opposed to all the other sins? Gam yaver val yarig, he must violate and not allow himself to be killed. And the answer, Hainu, so Rebbe answers, Kipirish Chazal, like the Chazal tell us, Amar Teira says, Chalel of Shabbos Achaz, Kidei Sheish Mishabbos is Harbe. That the Teira says, desecrate one Shabbos in order that you should be able to keep many Shabbos. So the first thing the Alter Rebbe says, which obviously we can continue further argue, you can say apparently the same thing when it comes to idolatry. But the Alter Rebbe says that the idea of it's not, doesn't mean to say that life and death, or when someone's life is in danger, that overrides the chilul of Shabbos, the desecration of Shabbos. No, not at all. The Torah is saying it's about keeping Shabbos. Because if you allow yourself to be killed on that Shabbos, you will never keep another Shabbos again in the rest because the guy is going to, because you will be expired, you'll be killed. So you'll never be able to keep a Shabbos again. Obviously, it's Chil Samasim, to the resurrection of the dead, but in the way it is in one's life, if he allows himself to be killed, he will definitely give up his life for the sake of this Shabbos, but no more Shabbosim anymore, because he's not alive. However, if he'll violate this very Shabbos, so eventually he will be able to keep many Shabbos. So the answer to this, or the reason why Teda says, when it comes to a situation of life or death, when it comes to saving one's life, that overrides Shabbos, it's not that there is a certain leniency or less weight in energy in the Aveda or in the mitzvah of Shabbos. The answer is the opposite is so true. Shabbos is similar to Avodah Zarah, similar to heresy, violating the Shabbos. And the positive mitzvah of Shabbos is Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am Hashem your God, which is again the positive command in the proclamation and proclaiming and the demonstration of Hashem Echad, the oneness of Hashem.
Is it only applicable to oneself or to the other person as well? Like you say, the other persons also you're allowed to.
The what?
Not just in regard to yourself, but also to the other person?
I didn't understand the question. Say that again.
You can transgress
Shabbos. For example, Shabbos.
To save yourself. Can you do it to save somebody else?
You're sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. Because Pikuach Nefesh, but again, when the Rebbe is saying it's not because of the leniency of the Aveda, that Shabbos is less. Quite on the contrary, the whole notion of Teda telling you violate the Shabbos in order to violate the Shabbos is just for one purpose, to tell you that it is about Shabbos. Because if you'll stay alive, you'll be able to guard many Shabbos. So it's not because of the cheapness or the less of the energy which exists in other mitzvahs. For example, when it comes to Shabbos, over the Aveda or the mitzvah of Achdus Hashem, or the Aveda or the sin of idolatry. No, it's because of the sanctity of Shabbos, because of the gravity of Shabbos. Therefore, Teda tells you, violate once, in order you should be able, you'll live another 50 years, you will keep 50 times 50 amount of Shabbos. Now, one is going to argue, okay, so it is about Shabbos, but what about Avodah Zarah itself? Maybe I should be able to do the same thing. Bow down once, and eventually I'll be able to live a life all about proclaiming to myself and to others about the oneness of Hashem. You can continue arguing. What are you telling me that it's not about the Shabbos? How about the leniency of Shabbos? That Teda says that violate the Shabbos. In other words, saving a life overrides the sanctity of Shabbos. Then what do we answer? That it's not so, that it's about Shabbos itself, because if you'll stay alive, you'll be able to keep many Shabbos. If the individual will kill you, you won't be able to keep no Shabbos. So it's quite on the contrary. It's because of the sanctity of Shabbos do we tell the person violate one Shabbos in order that he should be able to keep many, many Shabbos. So if that's the case, one is going to argue the same thing. When it comes to the need, according to Teda, the mandate one has to sacrifice his life, not to prostrate in front of Avodah Zarah, you say the same thing. Today I'll stay alive, tomorrow I'll announce to the entire world about the oneness of Hashem. And yet we say, no, don't make any of your calculations. Don't tell God what you're going to do for Him. When it comes to the sin of idolatry, one must give up his life. Stalter Rebbe says, firstly, he says, in the spirit of what he just came from, about violating his Shabbos, in order, and then at the end of the day, it's about Shabbos. It's not because there's a leniency in Shabbos, quite on the contrary. It's, in other words, it's not that we relegate, there's a relegation of Shabbos, not because Shabbos has less intrinsic value, quite on the contrary, because of the intrinsic value of Shabbos, therefore we tell a person violate that day in order you should be able to keep many Shabbos. But not because of the leniency of the Avedas, the sins, and their stringencies, as we Alter Rebbe wrote, that every sin is about idolatry, maybe a deraisa, even a rabbinic command. If one violates, in other words, because what underlines the mitzvah or the avera is about renouncing or protesting the oneness of Hashem, and therefore every avera is idolatry. Every mitzvah is Anochi Hashem Elokecha. So why are you allowed to violate the Shabbos? Because in the end of the day it's about Shabbos, not because of the leniency of the sins and their stringencies. And where do we see a proof? The Alter Rebbe brings a beautiful proof in Nigla, which means from the halachic dimension of Teda. Teda, a proof that Shabbos Chamura Ushkula Kaved Zarah L'Nishchitas Mumor L'Davar Echad. The violation of Shabbos is comparable to Avodah Zarah, to idolatry, with regards to the shchita by anyone who violates a particular mitzvah, as is written in Yeridei. What he says like this: when it comes to Shabbos, and when it comes to shchita, for example, when it comes to slaughtering an animal, we know that it has to be done precisely by a yid. In order that the animal should be able to be eaten. We know, according to halacha, you can't just kill an animal. You must do the formal shechita, ritual slaughtering. When you slaughter the animal based on the rules of Torah, you may consume it. If not, you're not allowed to. We know, though, that a yid, that has to be a Jew who slaughters the animal. The mitzvah shechita is given over to a Jew, and it's the Jew who can execute this mitzvah. A non-Jew who shechts, even though he shechts it beautifully on his own, he goes ahead and he takes his knife and shechts it, the animal is rendered as a treifa animal. It must be a Jew. Now the Jew himself, it says, that if the Jew is an idolater, in other words, he is someone who doesn't believe in the oneness of Hashem, he's Avodah Avodah Zarah. He commits idolatry. So he is considered, right? He is not allowed to shecht. He's not allowed to be the slaughterer. If he slaughters the animal is also rendered a treifa animal. When he's Avodah Avodah, because he's an Avodah Avodah Zarah, because he's someone who serves idols. He violates the grave sin of idolatry. He's puzzle. He's exempt, or not exempt. He is disqualified from being a sheikh. The halacha goes on and says, what if someone violates the Shabbos? He's a mechalel Shabbos, but for Hesya probably it's known that he violates the Shabbos. Could he be the shochet? Does his slaughtering count? Is it considered is he considered a qualified shechita? In other words, is his shechita, is his slaughtering considered kosher? In other words, the animal kosher if someone who violates the Shabbos, a mechalel Shabbos, someone who desecrates the Shabbos, is his slaughtering kosher? The answer, according to halacha, no. If he is a mechalel Shabbos, if somebody who's known to repeatedly violate and desecrate the Shabbos, he is like an Avodah Avodah Zarah, he's like an idolater, he is like someone who violates the sin of idolatry.
Just a secular Jew.
What? If somebody who violates the Shabbos, if somebody publicly violates the Shabbos, B'chal Shabbos V'Hesya, namely, Mumril Davarachad, you see someone who, frankly, is indifferent and apathetic to the whole mitzvah of Shabbos, he's considered like an Avodah Avodah Zarah, like someone who commits adultery. Okay? Now, Shabbos, and this is the proof the Alter Rebbe brings over here. When it comes to Shabbos, is Shabbos one of the three sins that one must give up his life for? The answer is no, it's not. As we mentioned before, if someone threatens somebody that he will kill him if he doesn't violate the Shabbos, he's allowed to violate the Shabbos. Yet when it comes to the shechita, when it comes to the slaughter, right, they come to ritual slaughtering, someone who serves idolatry, someone who's an idolater, he is disqualified from shechting. Similarly, if someone's a mechal Shabbos v'resin, and he is completely indifferent to the mitzvah of Shabbos, his shechita is also possible. His shechita is also a shechita psula, which means it's disqualified. It's non-kosher. It's rendered as a treifa animal. It's considered a treifa animal. Yet there's another mitzvah. When it comes to one of the three sins, which Torah clearly says that you must give up your life for, which is, again, remember the three sins: idolatry, adultery, and murder. For when it comes to adultery, if someone is suspected that he's an adulterer, and he shechts, is his shechita, is his slaughtering considered treif or kosher? The halacha says that if he was a mumer legili aroyis, if he's somebody who is apathetic to the whole violation of adultery, in other words, he commits frequently adulterous acts, his shechita is still kosher. That's the halacha. Isn't that surprising? Yes. Because if to one of the big three averos, if he is somebody who is indifferent to that sin, in other words, he commit adultery, his shechita is kosher. When it comes to Shabbos, Shabbos is not one of those big three sins. And where do we see it? Because pikuach nefesh, when it comes to giving up one's life, Shabbos is not part of the three averos. You're allowed to violate Shabbos when it comes if there's a situation, a state of life that to save a life.
So you think violating the sexual is more?
So one would say because Gila Aroyis, which means committing adultery, which is one of the three. When it comes to the shoichet, when it comes to the shchita, if Shabbos disqualifies the animal from being eaten, in other words, it renders the animal as today, how much more so one of the big three? If someone is indifferent to the one of the Gilei Arayis, and it was adultery, which is one of the big three Avedas, which one does have to give up his life for sure. Apparently, one would say his shchita is not kosher, but yet the halacha says that when it comes to Gilei Arayis, someone who's a mumar, which means that he commits, he frequently violates Gilei Arayis, which means the sin, the grave sin of adultery, which is one of the three Avedas, his shchita is kosher. So what Alter Rebbe is saying is that the whole, nonetheless, that's to save a life that overrides Shabbos, but not adultery. In other words, if someone tells somebody, commit adultery, if not I'll kill you, you have to let yourself be killed. So what is Alter Rebbe telling you? From here we see that according to Halacha, that it's not something you can make sense of and say this is because this is a grave sin and this is not such a grave sin, therefore you have to give up your life for this and you don't have to give up your life for this. We show you that the whole thing doesn't begin to make sense as it reflects in the halachas of shchita. So what is taka the reason? In other words, what the Alter Rebbe is saying, the truth of the matter is that every sin is about Avodah Zarah. Every sin ultimately is about renouncing the one of Hashem. So why is it that when it comes to Shabbos you're allowed to violate the Shabbos, and other sins you're not? When it comes to the big three, or namely when we're dealing over here with Avodah Zarah, one has to give up his life. Gzeiras HaKosav. It's an edict of the verse. Don't try to make sense of it, because the whole thing doesn't make sense. It's just God, for whatever reason He has, capital H, right? Whatever reason He has, He decided this you ought to give your life up, and this you don't have to give your life up for.
You can't find. So you say looking for logic is pointless.
It's right, exactly. It's pointless, and he brings up proof from halacha that if it was about the gravity of the sin, then the shchita for someone who is committing a Gilei Arayis, for sure it should have been a disqualified shchita, and he has to see it's kosher. So the whole thing doesn't begin to make sense. So why is it that here Hashem says give up your life? You're not, because there's Hashem decided. Now, what was the Alter Rebbe deriving from this? That in the end of the day, he remains with this explanation that in the end of the day, ultimately every sin, maybe avera kala, a lenient sin, it's all about denial of the oneness of Hashem. It's all about heresy. It's all about idolatry, and therefore we have to be extremely careful when it comes to a sin, just say a small sin, a big sin, because there is no small sin. Every sin is grave, and every sin is tantamount to Avodah Zarah. And for Avodah Zarah, one would give up his life. How careful and scrupulous we have to be to do all the mitzvahs I say and to stay away from every leisesa. Because every sin is about Avodah Zarah, based on the beautiful build-up and this profound explanation and expansion of the Alter Rebbe in these previous chapters. And in other words, in Alter Rebbe is saying, don't bring a question, why, don't bring in this question why for actual idolatry one has to give up his life, because the whole reason for that is not something we could make sense of. It's nothing to do with the gravity of the sin, as he brings the proof from his shchita. It's just Gzeiras HaKosav. It's a decree. It's a decree of the pasuk of the verse, scriptural decree. So the only thing is, what Rebbe is getting at over here is, so in the end of the day, is there, according to Torah, the definition, does it exist a definition of a lenient Avera and a grave Avera? The Alter Rebbe is saying over here, so ultimately, let's get down to the based on this explanation of the Alter Rebbe, every sin is about Avodah Zarah, is about idolatry. So is the Alter Rebbe saying, am I cancelling, does it mean that we cancel the whole notion of a chet chamor, something which is a grave sin and something which is considered as a lenient sin, or something a lighter sin? Are we cancelling this whole notion because every sin, like the Alter Rebbe says, even a drabanan, based on this whole explanation, even a rabbinic prohibition, avera kala, a light sin which is classified by Torah as a light sin, based on a rabbinic dictate, is it something that is also associated, or that is a violation in tantamount to Avodah Zarah, synonymous with Avodah Zarah? So the Alter Rebbe says, am I cancelling the whole idea of Avera Kala, Avera Chamora, a lenient Avera, a strict Avera? We know that in Torah itself there's certain Averas which there's capital punishment, there's certain Averas which there is Misa B'dei Shamayim, the heavenly court takes the person away, Kodesh, the strap, and so on. Now we're cancelling the whole idea that all Averas are truly truly the same. So the Alter Rebbe says like this: when you're dealing with the sin on the onset, when you're standing in front of the sin, and one has the test, one is examining, or one has the confrontation with the challenge, let's put it this way, the challenge and the temptation to violate a certain sin, he should know that every sin is to be looked at like Atavei Zara, like it's about idolatry, and the gravity which exists by idolatry truly exists by every sin. The only difference between the sins is subsequent to the act. Once, God forbid, someone did violate this particular sin, then there is a difference. How much of the blemish, how much did it blemish, how much did it taint his neshama? In what way is he reprimanded, or in what way what process is he part of in the context of the cleansing of his neshama from this sin, cleansing from the neshama from this blemish which the sin made on his soul? There's a difference between one sin and another. When the person stands in front of the temptation or in front of the challenge, when he stands in the onset, in other words, when he looks at the sin, you should know he looks at rather the challenge, then he's never to differentiate between one sin and another sin. Never at all. To know that every single Aveira, every single challenge, maybe it's Aveira Kala, maybe it's even a Draban or Rabbinic prohibition, and something which Torah classifies as a lenient sin. Even something which Torah says it's a lenient sin. Yet we should know, in our eyes, when we stand in front of that challenge, we have to know it's Avodah Zarah, it's idolatry. Again, based on this whole explanation of Rebbe in the previous chapters. And as it culminates in this chapter, in the previous classes, as we elaborated and expanded on this idea. But what the only difference is between one sin and another is after the sin. God forbid a person violated, advertently or inadvertently. Then there's a difference that we take out the package and we look at the sin itself, and we say that because certain sins have graver, more stringent consequences, and certain sins according to Torah has less stringent consequences, or certain sins in the Torah have lighter consequences in the context of punishment, how we reprimand the person, which is a clear demonstration and sign how deep did the blemish enter in the neshama. Hence, what kind of cleansing process this person needs. And that's where it exists the whole idea of Aveira Kala, or Aveira Chamura, a light sin, or a gray sin, and so on, based on the process of again in hindsight, or in retrospect, after the person chas v'shalom violated, then there's a difference between one sin and another. And that's what he goes on. After chas v'shalom a person sinned, if he fell through for whatever reason, right? Because Avodah Zarah, also idolatry, one could also. It's not like idolatry never happened. A person could fall through in idolatry also. And the same thing when he fell through, it's not because of like we said, not because of the leniency of the sin, because the healthy-minded person, based on all this explanation, looks at every sin as Avodah Zarah, as idolatry. But idolatry one could fall through also, Rahman al-Islam. So the person fell through in this sin, which according to Torah, it is idolatry. Yet, after the sin, if it's a type of sin that there's no kares and no midas b'shamayim, in other words, it's a type of sin that doesn't carry any penalty of kares. What is kares? It's the spiritual, right, extinction of the soul, but ultimately reflects on the cut off. Kares is also cutting away of the connection of soul and body. And the person would pass away after a certain amount of years, basically 50 or 60. There's an argument. Or death in Misa b'Deshamayim, death in the hands of heaven, which is also a penalty which is decided by the heavenly court, which is, it says, is an argument. Kodesh is by 50 years, Misa b'Deshamayim is by 60, or vice versa. There's an argument which is which. But these are clear punishments. God forbid we have the ability, they should accept our tshuva, and he should. The heavenly court, again, there's the famous, the court down here, the best down here, even a person could scream that I did tshuva if he deserves the death penalty. If he could scream from that he's doing tshuva from throughout in the process of his court case, he could clearly do tshuva and demonstrate to the court that he's doing tshuva, but the court doesn't know. It says the court cannot override a punishment. The court cannot overgo a punishment if a man deserves capital punishment and there's adequate testimony of him deserving the capital punishment, they must go along. They must go along through the process till they would take them away. But when it comes to Kodesh, which means via the heavenly court, via God, I'm just saying this parenthetically, it says that the person, because he's dealing with a court which knows very well what goes on within his heart, the physical court just can see, could scream from today till tomorrow that he's doing shuvah. The court, Beth Shalmat, in other words, the court, the Bezdin in this world, it says they could ain l'dayin al mashein avrayis. He could only see with his naked eye what's happening. In the end of the day, he saw there's testimony this person did a certain violation in which he deserved capital punishment. His tshuva, his inner repentance, the dayin Bezdin cannot see. The heavenly court sees so much more. So I'm saying this again, just parenthetically, that there is more chance to do tshuva based on this again, based on halacha. The Rama brings it as well. But let's not go off the subject without the Rebbe is saying over here, after the sin, if it's a type of sin that does not have, according to Torah, the consequence of kares or misa b'dei shamayim, in other words, death in the hands of heaven, she'ein nafshu likis meisa legamri, this would be considered categorically a lighter sin. Not on the onset, but in hindsight, if the person violated, here you could pinpoint, says, what's the consequence according to Torah of this sin? And you notice that it's not about kares. There's no consequence about kares, no consequence of misa b'dei shamayim. In other words, she'ein nafshe likis meisa legamri, his godly soul does not completely die, doesn't completely perish, and cut away from its roots and its source in the root of Hashem, which is again called God of life, because He provides the life and the flow of energy into every single human being. And it says in a number of places the reason why a person gets cut off in this world, God forbid, in other words, he expires at a certain age, is because what's happening is that his godly soul was cut away from the source of life, which is again God, which is called the God of life. So there was an inadequate flow of energy, life and energy coming from the godly reservoir of life into the person's neshama. He got cut away. How did he get cut away? Because he did that violation. In other words, when Hashem, when you see a consequence, when you see a punishment in the Torah, it's not like Hashem just says, okay, I think on that one I'm going to stop by kares, the other one misa b'dei shamayim, the other one capital punishment, the other one strap. No. When you see a certain punishment connected and associated with a certain sin, the reason why there's such a punishment is just a demonstration, or rather, when you see a punishment connected to a certain sin, that is a demonstration of the gravity of the sin, that it tainted the neshama so much that there's no way that this person could continue living, and Bezin must take him away. When it comes, for example, to kares, because he did this sin, so he cut away, he literally sliced the cord of life which comes from God into his neshama via that sin. As we know, again, this is the idea, this is why he receives kares, this is why this punishment is connected to this sin, because Hashem is telling us that sin slices the cord of life, the chelik Hashem, the cord, Yaakov Chavel Nachalasi, the cord which comes from God into the neshama, is explained again as Hatshuva, and through the neshama into the body. Because he cut it off, so his neshama is disconnected from God. Consequently, the person would physically expire as well. Because when you see again a certain punishment, a consequence attached to a certain sin, that is a demonstration of what's transpiring when the person violates. That he cut in so deep, that he cut away, he cut off the whole entire flow of energy. But however, here he's dealing with an Aveda which does not have kares, and does not have misa b'dei shamayim, and therefore his nefesh halikis, his godly soul, is not completely cut away from its source in God, which is again called the God of life. A little bit was cut away. Like, for example, you're going to have, let's say, a chandelier with many, many cords, right? And it touches, it comes together in one thick, combination of the cords. There's one way that you would just snip the top. The chandelier is inevitably going to come down and crash into and shatter into pieces. Well, I didn't really touch the chandelier. You cut it away. from where it's hanging from. Because it's connected to the ceiling. In other words, the cords is what's keeping it up. You snip the cords, the chandelier is coming down. But we know the cords themselves, you can have many cords. What if I snipped one cord? Not necessarily the chandelier is coming down. What if I snip two? The chandelier is not coming down yet. And what if the chandelier has 613 cords? So we know there's certain sins which are not a particular cord. It is as the cords come together, it's a complete snip. The fact that Torah says the person receives kodesh means he's cut away, and God forbid it would reflect even in the person's physical life that after 50 or 60 years he would be completely cut.
Jews, or does it apply to non-Jews as well?
No, it's regarding Jews, because Chelik Hashem Amnei, it's the unique connection the Jew has with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because again, his neshama being a chelik of the kamimal, a part of Hashem. So he's connected to the flow, to the source. The source of a yid is God, the God of life. So there's certain avedis which is a complete snip. But a certain avedis which is again snips of certain cords, not necessarily brings the chandelier down in the context of men. In other words, this is the reason why there's no kodesh. The person would remain alive after the 50 or 60 years, because he didn't cut away through the sin. He didn't cut away completely into the thickness of the cord. Just there was one little cord. Now, even though the Alter Rebbe, interesting, in Gezat Tshuva, he says, what if you take a snip one cord, and another cord, and another cord? Just the individual cords, the chandelier doesn't come down. But if you do it too often, it starts shaking the chandelier from its foundation or from its source. And eventually, you do all these individual cords, the chandelier will equally come down as well. And the Alter Rebbe therefore says that certain times the same sin, even though according to Torah it's classified as a kalba, we repeat the same sin, or other sins, in the end of the day we're snipping at these little short cords. But here, let's talk about what he says over here, that a person who violated a sin which we did not have the penalty of kares, or misaved, which is a demonstration of the fact that the violation of this sin doesn't cause a complete snip of the thickness of where the cords come together, or all the cords, or something which is crucial of the existence of the in this case we were speaking about the chandelier, the candelabra chandelier, but in the nimshul over here we're speaking about the neshama. He didn't cut away completely his connection from the stream of life which is his source, which comes within Elikim Chaim, in the life of God, which is called Elikim Chaim, a God of life. What he did was he just blemished a bit. By one cord means the connection and the attachment to his source via this violation. So then, if he did so, where are we holding over here? So because what he did, he just blemished a part of the connection. He didn't snip the attachment of his entire neshama to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So therefore there's more room for repair. What does it mean, more room for repair? That is the animal soul which is invested in his body, and his body as well as his body, because it's only a small blemish, or a blemish rather, not a complete cutaway, a blemish in the connection. So consequently, where does it reflect? That everything could hook on again, right? When you fall a little bit and you could still hold on, you swing out of your place. You could grab something and hold back on. But if you're completely hanging off and someone snips the cord, you can't just grab something and hang on again, because you're rolling down. Maybe a mountain or anything else. The same thing over here. So because it's just a particular sin which does not have the consequence of Kodesh Midas Shemai, and therefore the Neshama is not completely cut away. And because it's not completely cut away, where does it reflect? That he could again reattach himself, the animal soul, which is invested in the body. And even the body itself, they did enter into negative territory, which is the spirit of impurity, which is the spirit of Avodah Zarah, like we said, by this sin. But because it doesn't, according to Torah, have the consequence or the penalty of Kodesh Mitzvah Shemaim, they could ascend from the Sitra Achra, they could ascend from this Klippa, and they could start again reuniting and reinvigorating their connection to the sanctity of the connection to the sanctity of the nefesh elikis, to the godly soul, which is invested in the animal soul. They could much easier, in a much more easier fashion, reconnect to the godly soul, which mamina b'Hashem echad, which believes in the oneness of God, because this is the nature of the neshama. We will stop over here, but let's just conclude this because, like I said, I thought I would be able to finish the chapter, but we'll stop over here because the time does not allow us to finish the chapter. Because the neshama, the godly soul itself, always believes in the oneness of Hashem. It never had a problem with the one. It never really disconnected from its source. In other words, overtly, the nefesh bahamis, or better to say, the godly soul always remains a chelik elikami mal mamash, a part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The godly soul makes no mistake. It always believes in God because it's a part of God. The problem is the way, like someone said, everything is good and everything is peaceful. When I do the good stuff, I do with my godly soul, my yitzhak. When I do the bad stuff, I do with my animal soul, with the yitzhak. But it doesn't work that way, my friends. Because when it comes to the way the Hashem set things up, the godly soul, even though it's a separate party, right? As Alter Rebbe is one of the main messages of Alter Rebbe, through the first 12 chapters, and later 13, 14. In other words, as he establishes the way the Yid functions, that it's two separate parties. There's a godly soul and there's an animal soul. We call, let's say, it's a toiv, it's a rara. But the Alter Rebbe says in a number of places before, but here it becomes very relevant, that we can't, in the end of the day, the godly soul is invested in the animal soul. So when the person via his animal soul, which has this lust and has this temptation to do something wrong, it's not only the animal soul is investing in the world of sitra achra, in the world of impurity, in the world of klipa, in the world of tumah, but no, it's pulling, because the godly soul is invested in Nefesh Bahamis, so it's pulling the Nefesh Bahamis, and it's impurifying the godly soul, the Nefesh Elikis rather, it's impurifying the godly soul. You can imagine the great Rahmanis, the great pity, as Alter Rebbe is going to point out later, the great pity of the godly soul, it's pulled into a territory and into an area that it abhors. Because the godly soul never forgets for a moment where it comes from, because the godly soul is a part of God. And it never disconnects in its belief, in its focus, in its objective, or in its focus, in its connection, in its profound belief in the Hashem Echad and the oneness of Hashem, because it's a godly soul. The godly soul is all about God. It never forgets about that connection, and it always stands with complete faith and believe in the oneness of Hashem. The problem is the animal soul, together with the body, is pulling and again giving into its covet and temptation and its lust. It's pulling the godly soul into areas where the godly soul is disgusted by it. And Alter Rebbe will use later, it's like, for example, going to a king's palace, grabbing the face of the king, pulling it into a basket full of waste. You could think about anything so embarrassing and shameful and terrible than that. It doesn't exist. And that's what's really happening when a person sins. The godly soul always remains godly, because it's a never chelik elikami mal mamash. And the godly soul, but nonetheless, it's not separated from it. It invests in the animal soul. And when the animal soul gives it in to an animalistic temptation, the nefesh elikis is going along with it. And ultimately, what is the nefesh elikis? What is the godly soul? The godly soul is part of God. So if a person, like Alter Rebbe says this example, he's like taking the face of the king and forcing it and pulling it into a basket full of waste, which is again the world of impurity. It's called a basket. It says in a number of places, Mrat and Zar, it's a basket full of psoa, a basket full of waste. That is the world of impurity. That's the world of sitrach. So when a person sins, the Nefesh Bahamis, the animal soul is pulling through the person's deliberate decision, because of his lust and temptation of his body, which again connected with the animal soul, with the animalistic temptation and lust, he's pulling the godly soul into this wastebasket. So the pity is on the nefesh elikis, but based on what we just said over here, this depends, and this is where there's a difference between one sin and another sin. Not in the onset. In the onset, every sin is about idolatry, but in hindsight or in retrospect, after the person chas v'shalom sinned, then this is where it depends on the consequence, the penalty of the sin, if it's a sin which is not about kares. In other words, the penalty of the sin is not kares, a complete disconnect. And as we said, it is a snip of the source of the neshama to the source of to the Lakim Chaim, to the flow of godly energy, or the energy of life which enters into the neshama and ultimately gives the person his Chaim Gashmi, his physical life. It's not about kares, it's not about Misa B'dei Shamayim. It's a sin which there is just a gam, the lashon over here, it's a blemish in the connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because it's just a blemish, the person could hook on immediately and again ascend to the sanctity of the Nefesh Elikis, which never had a problem to begin with. Because Nefesh Elikis is always holy. It is always, it remains in its original state of sanctity, and it never forgets where it comes from. It always has that belief, that firm belief in Hashem, and faith in Hashem. It was just pulled into this experience, but because it's a sin, which its penalty is not kares, and not Misa B'dei Shamayim, therefore the person could again reattach himself, his body, his Nefesh Baham, the animal soul, to that sanctity of the Nefesh Elikis. And we'll finish over here, but Alter Rebbe says in the Haggah, which means in this little note, that this is these are the differences of the different cleansing processes which exist within the neshama in this world, God forbid, or in Gehenna. We deal with Gehenna and purgatory. What is the difference between one penalty and another penalty? It's all about, it's not that Hashem just stopped by certain sins and says, this sin has this penalty, and that sin has that penalty. All these differences are based on the depth of how deep the sin has penetrated, based on the gravity of the sin, which tells us basically how deep the blemish of the sin, or the dirt, or the tumah, the impurity of the sin had penetrated in the neshama. That's how much there's the miruk and the einish, the punishment, the retribution which exists in this world, or chachman al in Gehenna, how to ultimately cleanse the neshama. These are the different processes again, each one which is another, which is a way to ultimately alleviate the neshama from the blemish, based and depending on how much the blemish has penetrated into the neshama, based on the gravity of the sin. But again, this is the Haggah, which we'll maybe go through it the next week. But in the meantime, as we learn over here, that because this is not a sin which its penalty is kares, and therefore it could reattach itself much easier, the body, the Nefesh Bahamis, back to the sanctity of the Nefesh Elikis. Have a wonderful night.